and with a simple storeroom in the back, in this case. The main finds from this period, and I should also say that this palace was similarly decorated to the palace at Newsy, but instead of paintings, these beautiful paintings, we actually see evidence of really rich, ornate decoration. We find silver nails and silver sheeting that would have been put up on the walls, also probably gilding furniture, ivory inlays and copper sheets. So it's a very, very rich appointments in this palace. The sculptures that are coming out of this period, and specifically out of this temple, are similar to those that we find in the far west. For example, right, we have Idrimi from Alalak. This statue of a seated man, if you thought that Idrimi was awkward, this one is particularly awkward. This was found in the temple at Tel Brak, also another Mitanni statue. And it's, of course, not just poorly preserved, but very interestingly executed. Its proportions are a bit bizarre, with these spindly legs, large, broad arms. This seems to go back to a tradition in the region that goes back as early as the Middle Bronze Age, around 18th century, again like the time of Shemshi-Adad. At places like Ebla, for example, we see statues devoted to ancestors, right? Similar to the same devotional statues that we've seen since the third millennium, showing up in temples. At Ebla, for example, right, we see this individual set up, and you look at his hand position here, right, with this one arm and then another one, right, his right arm crossed across his chest. Similar to what we see at Brak, but identical actually to what we see with Idrimi. The same devotional pose, and probably used for the same purpose, right? Set up as a dedication in a statue or in a temple. One of the things that binds the Mitanni Empire together is its pottery. We tend, again, at the risk of associating pots with people, the Mitanni have a very specific type of pottery, and this is called Newsy ware. And you can see the motifs on it, the styles are very particular. This is really very, very unique, not just in its execution, but also in the material itself. The pottery is very thin, it's eggshell thin, would have been very difficult to make. This is a luxury ware. This is something that isn't going to be used on a daily basis. This is more your fine china that you're going to trot out for specific events or ceremonies. And you can see it's not a very practical vessel either. Most of these Newsy ware vessels have what are called button bases, which makes it very, very difficult to use them. The patterning is light paint on a dark background, and you can see this piece is actually from Tel Brak as well. We find large concentrations of it at the site of Newsy, where it was first discovered, so that's why it's called Newsy ware. We find it at Alalak, at all of these Mitanni sites. So it's sort of a type indicator. If we find this somewhere, we know that the Mitanni were there or were at least involved, right? Because there could have been sites trading with Mitanni and trading for these beautiful pieces as well. The other contribution that we find is glass making. And this emerges with the Mitanni around 1600 BC. And this is our next step in pyrotechnology, right? We talked about lime and plaster, we've talked about pottery. Now let's talk about glass, because this is quite a development. Glass allows you now to create vessels in a totally different style, and opens up a whole broad range of artistic developments. We find quite a lot of evidence at Tel Brak for early glass making, including these examples of really beautifully decorated vessels and ingots. You can see here, right, this wonderful inlay. And it's no coincidence that this happens with the Mitanni specifically, right? If we remember, the Mitanni are right up against the Mediterranean Sea in North Syria. They've carved out this empire for themselves, and they have access to the sea. And to make glass, it requires three things. The real recipe for glass comes down to three things. One is silica. It's about 75% silica. Silica is just sand, right? So, of course, sand comes from the beach. And if you have been to the Eastern Mediterranean, you know that the sand that's on the Eastern Mediterranean is all Nile silt sand, from sand that's been washed up, through the current of the Nile, pushed into the Mediterranean Sea, and then it gets deposited all along the side, up modern Israel and into Syria. So fine resources for sand, wonderful silica, boom, so that's step one. Step two, you need an alkali modifier. That sounds complicated, but really it's salt and ash. And the best way to get this is to take plants that grow near the sea, that naturally suck up sea salt, and burn them. So you break that down, and you have this alkali modifier, which helps to lower the firing temperature down. You mix that in, again, about 15 to 20%. And then finally, lime. You have about 10% lime. And lime comes from limestone, which, again, is also related to the sea in the sense that limestone was ancient seabed. And so Mitanni is perfectly situated to experiment with this new technology, and boom, they create these fantastic vessels, which again, you have to have a pretty high firing temperature for. These would be formed in high fire kilns at about 1400 degrees Celsius, at which point that whole mess, it melts together, and you can then use it and form vessels, cups, even cylinder seals. Glass, pure glass, right, it just has to do with, we have two different types of these. It's called vitrifying materials or vitreous materials. There's glass, there's also frit, and this cylinder seal is made out of frit. You can see here it's a glass-like substance. Some of you might be familiar with faience, Egyptian faience. Same thing, frit, faience. They're made in the same way as glass, except with different ingredients. For example, with frit and faience, often you have copper oxide, which is added to the mixture, which gives the frit, again, this is a frit bowl, these pieces of frit, this wonderful blue color. Those of you, like our Statue of Liberty, right? It's copper, it's made of copper, right? But it's got this fantastic patina because it's oxidized. That's why it's green. So that same green that makes the Statue of Liberty green is used in this frit to make these wonderful greens and blues. And why would this color in a cylinder seal be so attractive? Why would you want a blue cylinder seal like this one if you're a Mitanni official? Is this trying to emulate anything, do you think? This blue color? Yeah.
Like lapis lazuli?
Exactly. Yeah, this is an attempt to knock off lapis lazuli using local materials and mass producing them. So our Mitanni cylinder seals during this time are kind of some of our first knockoffs. This is kind of your fake Louis Vuitton bag of the ancient world. These Mitanni trying to emulate these materials, making a local production. And we see also in their cylinder seals very specific and unique iconography. Again, moving away from those balanced compositions of earlier periods, those presentation scenes. Now we've got these mythological scenes with composite animals, all sorts of things going on. We talked a bit about earlier types, and now, right, this same sense of horror vacui, right? This need to fill the entire composition with all sorts of odd things going on. So the Mitanni style of cylinder seal is very interesting. Unfortunately, a lot of this material, they're probably mythological scenes that we don't understand, but we do see some common elements: mountains in the background, horned goddesses, sphinxes, and what appear to be stylized palm trees, which we've talked about in depth. So by about 1400 BCE, at the end of the LB1, right? So LB is just late Bronze Age. We're going to look at these periods: late Bronze Age 1, late Bronze Age 2A and 2B. By about 1400 BCE, Mitanni has really carved out quite a niche for itself in Syria and northern Mesopotamia. You can see it right here, picking up the pieces of where Shemshi-Adad's empire fell apart. And we have records of the Mitanni expansion during this time. We're told that the Mitanni reached out and attacked the city of Ashur, bringing it under their control, carting off the golden doors of the temple at Ashur, bringing it back to Washukani, wherever Washukani is. Don't trust this map. This is a lie. Anyway, so we see this taking place. And the rise of Mitanni coincides with the rise of several other powers. We're moving into this new period, which is the Late Bronze Age, in which we see really what can be described as the first true period of international relations. These major powers that are now coming back on the scene. That includes Egypt, by the way. Egypt, at the end of the Middle Kingdom, suffered very much as the Near East suffered. The entire system fell apart. It was actually invaded by people from Canaan and the Levant, the Hyksos. We're going to talk about Egypt. In fact, over the next week or so, we're going to be addressing each one of these major powers one by one. During this period, again, 1600 to 1200 BCE. We see the rise of these large empires. And we've seen this before, right? Empire, fine, right? Large expanses of city-states, centralized control. But for the first time now what we're seeing is diplomatic contact between empires. A standard idea of what it means to be king. So, for example, by about 1400 BCE, again, 1350 or so, the major players on the scene, we've got Egypt, Mitanni, and Hatti in the north, right? Hatti being the Hittites. These kings are corresponding with one another using Akkadian as a lingua franca. So there is a common diplomatic language which is being spoken during this time. That's a huge development. Not only that, they're referring to one another as brother. So the king of Mitanni would write to the king of Egypt and refer to him as my brother. The Hittites would write to the Egyptians as brothers. This diplomatic correspondence is taking place. And not just that, diplomats are actually being sent to these different places, along with extravagant trade goods and the cementing of really international relations for the first time. We know quite a bit about this period from the texts of the time. A cache of over 350 letters were found at the site of Tel Amarna here in Egypt. We're going to be talking about Egypt specifically, I think, next week. But really it gives us a lot of insight into this period in which these kings interacted. For example, I'll give you a letter, one of the letters from the Amarna archive, as it's called. 350 letters, 300 deal mostly with Egypt and its holdings in the Levant, because we do have these central empires, right? Our capital is in Egypt proper, but right there are these vassal kingdoms in Canaan. 50 of those letters, though, deal with connections between like-minded rulers.